In the cold morning of May 19th, 1536, a French swordsman raised his blade and with one swift stroke severed the head of Anne Boleyn, Queen of England. Her crime? Adultery, incest, treason, charges so absurd that even contemporary observers doubted their validity. Yet Henry VIII, the man who had broken with Rome to marry her, now wanted her erased from history. He forbade mourning, destroyed her images, and declared their daughter Elizabeth a bastard unworthy of the throne. But history has a cruel sense of irony. The daughter Henry rejected would become the greatest monarch England had ever known, transforming her mother's supposed disgrace into the foundation of a golden age. This is the story of how Elizabeth V became the ultimate revenge for Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn's execution was meant to be an ending. Henry VIII had moved on before her blood dried on the scaffold, marrying Jane Seymour within 11 days. The message was clear. Anne had been a mistake, a temptress who had led him astray, and now that chapter was closed. But in the nursery at Hatfield House, a 2-year-old girl with auburn hair and dark eyes represented a truth Henry could not erase. Elizabeth carried her mother's blood, her intelligence, and her determination. Though Henry stripped her of her title and legitimacy, he could not strip her of her potential. The very qualities that had made Anne Boleyn dangerous, her wit, her education, her refusal to be conventional, lived on in Elizabeth. The circumstances of Elizabeth's childhood were designed to diminish her. After Anne's execution, the young princess was relegated to the bastard's household, her servants unpaid, her wardrobe inadequate. She was neither acknowledged nor completely forgotten, existing in a liminal space that reflected her father's ambivalence. Henry had wanted a son so desperately that he had risked his kingdom, his soul, and ultimately his wives to obtain one. When Anne gave him a daughter instead, it seemed like a cosmic joke. Yet even as a child, Elizabeth demonstrated the qualities that would define her reign. She was studious, cautious, and remarkably astute at reading the dangerous currents of Tudor politics. Every slight she endured, every humiliation she witnessed, taught her lessons about power, survival, and the price of being a woman in a man's world. Anne Boleyn's fall had been orchestrated with chilling precision by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, who turned the king's wandering affection into a legal case for execution. The charges were grotesque. Anne was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The evidence was extracted through torture and coercion, the testimonies contradictory and absurd. One of the accused men had supposedly been her lover on a date when she was verifiably pregnant and confined to chambers. Yet the court, packed with her enemies and presided over by her former suitor, the Duke of Norfolk, found her guilty. The sentence was death by burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. Henry, in a moment of twisted mercy, ordered a swordsman from Calais, considered more skilled and humane than the common executioner with an axe. Anne faced her death with remarkable dignity, a performance that haunted those who witnessed it. Dressed in a grey damask gown trimmed with fur, her hair bound up to expose her neck, she addressed the crowd gathered at Tower Green. She did not protest her innocence directly, as that would have endangered Elizabeth, but she spoke of her fate with measured words that left room for interpretation. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die according to law, and therefore I will speak nothing against it," she said, carefully avoiding either confession or denial. She asked for prayers, commended the king's mercy in choosing beheading over burning, and removed her headdress to kneel at the block. When the sword fell, witnesses reported that her lips continued to move in prayer even after her head was severed. Her body was placed in an arrow chest, as no proper coffin had been prepared, and buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower. Henry expected Anne's memory to fade as quickly as her blood was washed from the scaffold. He had Parliament declare the marriage invalid, making Elizabeth technically the product of an unlawful union. The king's narrative was simple. Anne had bewitched him, cuckolded him, and betrayed him. Her execution was justice, not murder, but Henry had miscalculated the one thing he could not control, his own mortality and the succession crisis that would follow. He would have his longed-for son, Edward, born to Jane Seymour less than 18 months after Anne's death. But Edward was a sickly child who would reign for only 6 years before dying at 15. Henry's fourth, fifth, and sixth wives produced no children. The great irony that Henry could never have foreseen was that the daughter he had rejected, the child of the woman he had destroyed, would be the one to secure his dynasty and exceed his legacy. Elizabeth's path to the throne was neither certain nor safe. After Henry's death in 1547, she survived the dangerous reign of her half-brother Edward VI, during which Protestant reformers sought to use her as a pawn. She navigated the even more treacherous reign of her half-sister Mary VIII, who saw Elizabeth as both a rival and a heretic. During Mary's reign, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where her mother had been executed. On suspicion of involvement in Wyatt's rebellion, she entered through Traitor's Gate, the water entrance that had admitted so many who never left alive. For 2 months, she lived in rooms near where her mother had spent her final days, uncertain whether she would face the same fate. Elizabeth's survival required every ounce of cunning she possessed. She outwardly conformed to Mary's Catholic regime while maintaining the loyalty of Protestant supporters. She gave nothing away, committed to nothing in writing that could condemn her, and waited with the patience of someone who understood that survival was the first requirement of eventual triumph. When Mary I died childless on November 17, 1558, Elizabeth ascended to the throne at age 25. The news reached her at Hatfield House, where she had spent much of her childhood in obscurity. According to tradition, she was sitting under an oak tree, reading when the delegation arrived to inform her that she was now Queen of England. Her first words, spoken in Latin, came from Psalm 118. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." It was a moment of profound vindication. The bastard daughter, the child of the executed adulteress, the princess who had been lucky to survive, she was now the supreme governor of the Church of England, the anointed monarch, the woman who would shape the destiny of a nation. In that instant, Anne Boleyn's legacy shifted from disgrace to destiny. Elizabeth was not just her father's daughter, she was emphatically her mother's child, and she would prove it through every decision of her 45-year reign. Elizabeth's coronation on January 15, 1559, was a deliberate statement of legitimacy and power. The ceremony followed ancient traditions that stretched back centuries, connecting her to the long line of English monarchs, while also introducing elements that reflected her unique position. She processed through London, dressed in royal purple and gold, her red hair flowing freely as a symbol of virginity and majesty. The crowds that lined the streets saw not a bastard or a woman of questionable birth, but a queen who embodied both the Tudor dynasty and the promise of a new era. The religious elements of the coronation were carefully managed. Elizabeth chose to be crowned by Owen Oglethorpe, the Catholic Bishop of Carlisle, after the Archbishop of York refused because she would not allow the elevation of the host during Mass. This compromise reflected the religious settlement she would pursue throughout her reign, a middle way that sought to unite a kingdom torn apart by decades of religious violence. The new queen understood that her legitimacy rested on a paradox. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, which meant she was the product of the marriage that had caused England's break with Rome and the establishment of the Protestant Church of England. Yet her father had legally bastardized her by declaring that very marriage invalid. Elizabeth's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. She never directly addressed the contradiction. Instead, she presented herself as Henry VIII's daughter and England's rightful queen by parliamentary statute and popular acclaim. She rehabilitated her mother's memory not through explicit declarations, but through the very fact of her successful reign. Every achievement, every victory, every year of stability became a testament to Anne Boleyn's worth. If Anne's daughter could be this magnificent, then Anne herself could not have been the evil temptress of Henry's propaganda. Elizabeth's religious settlement was Anne Boleyn's revenge in ecclesiastical form. Henry VIII had broken with Rome to marry Anne, making her the catalyst for England's Reformation. But Henry had remained theologically conservative, persecuting both Catholics who rejected his supremacy and Protestants who wanted more radical reform. His son Edward VI had pushed England toward Protestantism, while Mary I had violently restored Catholicism. burning nearly 300 Protestant martyrs in the process. Elizabeth's 1559 religious settlement established a moderate Protestant Church of England that would endure. The Act of Supremacy made her supreme governor of the Church, while the Act of Uniformity established the Book of Common Prayer as the standard for worship. This was Anne's legacy made permanent. The break with Rome that had cost Anne her life became the foundation of English identity for centuries to come. Elizabeth had accomplished what her mother never lived to see, a Protestant England that would never return to papal authority. The Queen's personal style echoed her mother's in ways both subtle and deliberate. Anne Boleyn had been known for her fashion sense, her introduction of French styles to the English court, and her use of appearance as a political tool. Elizabeth took this to an extraordinary level, developing the iconography of the Virgin Queen that became one of history's most successful exercises in image management. Her portraits were tightly controlled, showing an ageless, perfect monarch, adorned with symbols of power, purity, and divine favor. She owned thousands of gowns, each a statement of majesty and wealth. Like her mother, Elizabeth understood that a queen's appearance was never merely personal, it was political, symbolic, and strategic. The daughter had learned from the mother's example and expanded upon it, creating a visual language of power that compensated for the disadvantages of her gender in a patriarchal society. Elizabeth's court became a center of culture and learning that reflected Anne Boleyn's own intellectual interests. Anne had been educated in the sophisticated courts of the Netherlands and France, speaking French fluently, playing musical instruments, and engaging with the humanist and reformist ideas that were reshaping European thought. She had been a patron of scholars and reformers, promoting the translation of the Bible into English and supporting evangelical preachers. Elizabeth inherited this love of learning and became one of the best-educated monarchs in English history. She spoke 6 languages fluently, translated classical texts for pleasure, and surrounded herself with scholars, poets, and artists. Her court produced Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser. The Elizabethan age became synonymous with cultural flowering, a renaissance that made England a center of artistic and intellectual achievement for the first time. This was Anne's daughter, fulfilling the promise of Anne's own intellectual curiosity and cultural sophistication. The question of marriage became Elizabeth's most powerful weapon and her most complex challenge. From the moment of her accession, she was pressured to marry and produce an heir. Parliament petitioned her repeatedly, her councillors urged her constantly, and foreign princes courted her persistently. But Elizabeth had seen what marriage had cost the women in her family. Her mother had been executed, her stepmother, Catherine Howard, had been beheaded, and her sister Mary had been humiliated by a husband who abandoned her. Marriage meant subordination, pregnancy meant mortal danger, and husbands meant the surrender of power. Elizabeth chose a different path. She entertained suitors, allowed courtships to develop, and used the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool while never actually committing. She presented herself as married to England, declaring at her coronation that she was wedded to her kingdom. This was not just rhetoric, it was a revolutionary redefinition of queenship that turned her gender from a liability into a source of unique authority. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, came closest to marrying Elizabeth, and their relationship revealed the Queen's emotional complexity and political calculation. Dudley had known Elizabeth since childhood, and there was genuine affection between them. Rumours swirled that they were lovers, especially after Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, died under suspicious circumstances in 1560, falling down a flight of stairs and breaking her neck. The scandal made marriage to Dudley impossible, as it would have confirmed the worst suspicions about their relationship and suggested that Elizabeth had been complicit in murder. Yet she kept Dudley close for decades, making him her master of horse, granting him extraordinary honors, and creating an intimacy that fueled endless speculation. Some historians believe this was Elizabeth's way of having the emotional benefits of partnership while avoiding the political costs of marriage. Others argue it was a calculated performance designed to keep other suitors hopeful by demonstrating that she was capable of romantic attachment. Either way, Elizabeth maintained absolute control, never allowing her heart to override her political judgment, a lesson learned from her mother's fate. The presence of Mary, Queen of Scots, in England from 1568 onward created a crisis that tested Elizabeth's political skills and moral convictions. Mary was Elizabeth's cousin, a fellow queen, and a Catholic with her own claim to the English throne. She had been forced to abdicate in Scotland and fled to England seeking Elizabeth's protection. But Mary's presence made her a focal point for Catholic plots against Elizabeth's life and reign. For 19 years, Elizabeth kept Mary in gilded captivity, unwilling to execute a fellow monarch, but unable to release her. This impossible situation revealed Elizabeth's characteristic combination of caution and ruthlessness. She resisted pressure from her counselors to execute Mary, even as plot after plot emerged with Mary at its center. Only when the Babington Plot of 1586 provided irrefutable evidence of Mary's involvement in a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth did the Queen finally consent to her cousin's execution. Even then, Elizabeth tried to distance herself from the decision, claiming her secretary had sent the death warrant without her explicit authorization. Mary was beheaded at Fotheringay Castle on February 8, 1587, reportedly taking 15 minutes to die, as the executioner needed 3 strokes to sever her head. In eliminating Mary, Elizabeth had secured her throne and the Protestant succession, but the execution of an anointed queen troubled her conscience. Unlike her father, who had sent 2 wives to the scaffold without apparent remorse. The Spanish Armada of 1588 represented the greatest existential threat Elizabeth's England would face, and its defeat became the defining triumph of her reign. Philip II of Spain, once Mary V's husband and briefly Elizabeth's brother-in-law, had gradually transformed from potential suitor to mortal enemy. England's support for Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, Drake's raids on Spanish shipping and colonies, and Elizabeth's execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, finally prompted Philip to launch a massive invasion. The Spanish plan called for the Armada, a fleet of 130 ships carrying thousands of soldiers, to sail up the English Channel, collect the Duke of Parma's veteran army from the Netherlands, and invade England to depose Elizabeth and restore Catholicism. The stakes could not have been higher. If the invasion succeeded, Elizabeth would likely suffer her mother's fate: execution as a heretic and traitor. Everything Anne Boleyn had died for, everything Elizabeth had built, would be destroyed. Elizabeth's response to the crisis demonstrated the qualities that made her exceptional. While her counselors debated strategy and her captains prepared the fleet, Elizabeth herself became the embodiment of national resistance. In August 1588, as the Armada approached and invasion seemed imminent, she traveled to Tilbury to address her troops. Mounted on a grey gelding and dressed in a silver breastplate over a white velvet dress, she delivered one of history's most famous speeches. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she declared, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." She promised to live or die with her people, to take up arms herself if necessary. The speech was a masterpiece of rhetoric that transformed her gender from a weakness into proof of extraordinary courage. Here was a woman willing to face battle alongside her soldiers. What greater demonstration of commitment could any king provide? The defeat of the Armada was partially due to English naval tactics, partially due to weather that scattered the Spanish fleet, and partially due to Spanish logistical failures. English ships, lighter and more maneuverable than the Spanish galleons, harried the Armada as it sailed up the Channel. Fireships sent into the Spanish formation at Calais broke their defensive crescent. Atlantic storms completed the destruction as the Armada attempted to return to Spain by sailing north around Scotland and Ireland. Of the 130 ships that had left Spain, fewer than half returned. Perhaps 15,000 men died. England had survived, and Elizabeth's position was secured. The victory was celebrated as providential, a sign that God favored Elizabeth and Protestant England. Commemorative medals were struck with the inscription "God blew and they were scattered." The defeat of the Armada became part of English national mythology, a David versus Goliath story that confirmed England's special destiny and Elizabeth's divine right to rule. The Armada victory vindicated Anne Boleyn in the most fundamental way possible. Henry VIII had married Anne to get a male heir who would secure the Tudor dynasty and lead England to glory. Instead, Anne had given him a daughter whom he rejected, and a religious controversy that divided the nation. But that daughter had now defended England against the world's most powerful empire. She had proven that a woman could inspire loyalty, command military forces, and safeguard the realm as effectively as any king. The son Henry had wanted, Edward VI, had died young, without accomplishing anything of lasting significance. The elder daughter, Mary I, had married Philip of Spain and brought England into humiliating foreign wars that lost Calais, England's last continental possession. But Anne's daughter had made England a power to be reckoned with, had established its independence from European domination, and had begun the process of making it a maritime and colonial force. The irony would have been perfect if Anne could have witnessed it. Elizabeth's handling of religious extremism on both sides reflected a pragmatism that came from bitter experience. She had seen religious zealotry tear England apart during Edward's and Mary's reigns. Her solution was a via media, a middle way that sought to include as many of her subjects as possible while marginalizing the extremes. Catholics who accepted her rule and attended Church of England services, even if they privately maintained their old faith, were largely left alone. Puritans who wanted to reform the Church further were tolerated as long as they remained within the established structure. But those who challenged her authority, Catholic priests who proclaimed her a bastard and usurper, Puritan separatists who rejected the episcopal system, faced severe punishment. Over 180 Catholics were executed during Elizabeth's reign, mostly priests and those who harbored them. This was brutal, but significantly less than the nearly 300 Protestants Mary I had burned in just 5 years. Elizabeth understood that religious uniformity was impossible, but religious peace was essential. She reportedly said she had no desire to make windows into men's souls, caring more about outward conformity than private belief. The Queen's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, developed an intelligence network that protected Elizabeth from numerous assassination plots. Walsingham was a committed Puritan who saw the Catholic threat to Elizabeth as both political and spiritual. He placed agents in foreign courts, intercepted correspondence, and ran informants within the Catholic community in England. His network uncovered the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Babington plot, and numerous other conspiracies against Elizabeth's life. Many of these plots were linked to Mary, Queen of Scots, and it was Walsingham's patient intelligence work that finally provided the evidence needed to execute Mary. Some historians believe Walsingham occasionally embellished or even created plots to justify harsher measures against Catholics, but there is no doubt that the threats to Elizabeth were real. Pope Pius V had excommunicated her in 1570 and declared that her Catholic subjects had a duty to depose her. Assassination was not a paranoid fantasy, but a constant danger. The existence of a sophisticated intelligence apparatus to protect the Queen was both a sign of the times and a legacy that would influence English governance for centuries. Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament was complex and occasionally contentious, particularly regarding marriage, succession, and her monopoly grants to favourites. Parliament repeatedly petitioned her to marry and settle the succession, fears that were intensified by several serious illnesses that nearly killed her. In 1563, Elizabeth contracted smallpox and nearly died. Her counsellors panicked, realizing that England could descend into civil war if she died without a designated heir. But Elizabeth refused to name a successor, correctly understanding that doing so would create a rival power centre and potentially encourage plots against her. "Do you think I could love my winding sheet?" she asked, referring to how people would flock to her heir as soon as one was named. This stubbornness created enormous anxiety, but also kept her secure. As for monopolies, Elizabeth granted exclusive trading rights to favourites as a way of rewarding service without depleting the royal treasury. But these monopolies became increasingly unpopular as they raised prices and limited competition. When Parliament challenged this practice in 1601, Elizabeth responded with her famous Golden Speech, promising to reform the abuses while also reminding Parliament of her devotion to her people. It was a masterful performance that diffused the crisis and demonstrated her political skills even in old age. The economic and commercial expansion during Elizabeth's reign laid the groundwork for England's later imperial dominance. Chartered companies like the Muscovy Company, the Levant Company, and most importantly the East India Company were founded during her reign, establishing trade networks that would eventually span the globe. English privateers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh combined piracy, exploration, and trade, attacking Spanish ships and colonies while claiming new territories for England. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe from 1577 to 1580 was both a commercial venture and a strategic strike against Spanish power. When Drake returned with a ship full of plundered Spanish treasure, Elizabeth knighted him aboard the Golden Hind, a gesture that infuriated Philip II, but demonstrated Elizabeth's willingness to support those who enhanced English power and prosperity. Attempts to establish colonies in the Americas, particularly Raleigh's Roanoke colony, failed during Elizabeth's lifetime, but they established the precedent and ambition for later successful colonization. The Elizabethan economic expansion was sometimes brutal, often exploitative, but it transformed England from a second-tier power into an emerging commercial and naval giant. Elizabeth's court was a theater of power, where elaborate rituals, symbolic gestures, and carefully managed access to the Queen created a system that amplified her authority. The Privy Chamber, where Elizabeth spent much of her time, was attended by carefully selected ladies-in-waiting, who were often noble women. Access to the Queen was tightly controlled and highly valued. Those who attended her person were in positions to influence her decisions, deliver petitions, and advance their family's interests. Elizabeth deliberately fostered competition for her attention and favor, playing courtiers off against each other to maintain control. She could be generous to those who pleased her and ruthlessly cold to those who disappointed her. When one of her ladies-in-waiting, Lettice Knollys, secretly married Robert Dudley, Elizabeth was furious at the betrayal and banned Lettice from court permanently. This possessiveness extended to all her favorites. She expected absolute loyalty and became enraged when her courtiers married without her permission, viewing it as a form of disobedience and abandonment. The elaborate pageants, progresses, and entertainments of Elizabeth's reign served multiple purposes beyond mere pleasure. Each summer, Elizabeth embarked on a progress through the southern counties of England, staying at the homes of wealthy subjects who were expected to host her and her enormous entourage at ruinous expense. These progresses allowed Elizabeth to be seen by her people, reinforcing the bond between monarch and subject. They also kept her court moving, which was necessary for sanitation in an age without proper sewage systems. Most importantly, they distributed the financial burden of maintaining the royal household while reminding the nobility of their obligations to the crown. The entertainments staged during these visits were often elaborate allegorical performances that glorified Elizabeth as a virgin goddess, a wise Solomon, or a classical deity. These were not mere flattery, but sophisticated political theatre that constructed an image of the Queen as something more than human, a sacred figure whose virginity made her uniquely suited to be married to England itself. The cult of Gloriana, as Elizabeth came to be called, was a deliberate creation that served both political and psychological purposes. In a Protestant England that had rejected the veneration of the Virgin Mary, Elizabeth's imagery appropriated some of that Marian devotion and redirected it toward the Queen. Portraits showed her crowned, bejeweled, and surrounded by symbols of purity, wisdom, and power. The rainbow portrait shows her holding a rainbow with the inscription "Non sine sol iris," no rainbow without the sun, suggesting that her favor, like the sun, creates the rainbow of peace and prosperity. The Armada portrait depicts her with her hand on a globe, with the defeated Spanish fleet in the background, presenting her as the divinely favored protector of England. These images were reproduced and distributed, creating a visual propaganda campaign that reinforced her legitimacy and authority throughout the realm. Foreign visitors were awed by the spectacle of Elizabeth's court, which was designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Elizabeth's intellectual life was remarkable for any person of her era, but especially for a woman. She translated works from Latin, Greek, French, and Italian throughout her life, including Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and parts of Horace, Plutarch, and Seneca. She composed her own prayers and meditations, which were published after her death. She engaged in theological debates with university scholars and foreign ambassadors, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of the doctrinal disputes that divided Christianity. Her speeches, whether to Parliament, to her troops, or to her court, were carefully crafted pieces of rhetoric that demonstrated her classical education and her understanding of persuasive communication. This was Anne Boleyn's legacy, made manifest. Anne had been mocked by some contemporaries for her intellectual pretensions, for reading reformist literature and engaging in theological discussions that were considered unsuitable for women. Elizabeth not only embraced this same intellectual curiosity, but made it a cornerstone of her queenship, proving that a woman's mind could be as formidable as any man's. The tension between Elizabeth's public image of virginity and the rumors about her private life created a paradox that she never fully resolved. Various ambassadors, courtiers, and political enemies claimed that Elizabeth had lovers, had borne illegitimate children, or was physically incapable of sexual relations. None of these rumors were ever substantiated, and most were spread by those who wanted to delegitimize her reign. The claim that she could not bear children was particularly insidious, as it suggested that her refusal to marry was not a choice, but a necessity, undermining the image of the Virgin Queen who chose England over any man. Elizabeth was examined by midwives at various points to verify her virginity, humiliating procedures that male monarchs never had to endure. Whether she remained a virgin, her entire life is unknowable and in many ways irrelevant. What matters is that she successfully used the idea of virginity as a source of power, turning what was conventionally seen as a woman's purpose, marriage and childbearing, into proof of her unique dedication and her special relationship with her kingdom. The rebellion of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, in 1601 was both a personal betrayal and a political crisis that demonstrated the dangers of Elizabeth's style of rule. Essex was young, handsome, and charismatic, a favorite who had enjoyed Elizabeth's affection for years, despite his arrogance and military failures. When he was appointed to lead an army to suppress rebellion in Ireland, he failed spectacularly, made an unauthorized truce with the rebel leader, and then abandoned his command to rush back to England. He burst into Elizabeth's bedchamber early one morning, finding her without her wig or makeup, in a state of undress that no outsider was ever meant to see. It was a shocking violation of protocol and privacy, and Elizabeth never forgave him. When his privileges and monopolies were revoked, Essex attempted a coup, marching into London with armed followers to seize control of the court. The rebellion failed miserably. Essex was arrested, tried, and executed for treason in February 1601. Elizabeth signed his death warrant with less hesitation than she had shown for Mary, Queen of Scots. The young man had betrayed her in every possible way, and she would not make the mistake of mercy. Elizabeth's final years were marked by declining health, the deaths of old friends and counselors, and a growing awareness that her reign was ending. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, her most trusted advisor for 4 decades, died in 1598. His son Robert Cecil took over many of his father's responsibilities, but the loss of Burghley was deeply felt. The 1590s were economically difficult, with poor harvests leading to inflation and suffering among the common people. The war with Spain continued, draining resources without decisive victory. Elizabeth herself was aging visibly, despite the portraits that continued to show her as timelessly young. She still danced, still rode horses, still overawed visitors with her energy and intelligence, but she was in her 60s, in an age when that was considered very old. The question of succession loomed larger than ever, and Elizabeth finally, reluctantly, allowed her counsellors to communicate secretly with James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, to prepare for his eventual accession. It was a pragmatic acknowledgement of reality. Elizabeth had no direct heirs, and James was the closest Protestant claimant with a strong hereditary claim. The Queen's relationship with the arts and literature created a cultural legacy that outlasted her political achievements. The Elizabethan age produced William Shakespeare, whose plays were performed for the Queen and whose history plays helped construct the Tudor myth of providential monarchy. Christopher Marlowe pushed the boundaries of dramatic tragedy before his mysterious death. Edmund Spenser wrote The Fairy Queen, an epic poem that allegorically celebrated Elizabeth as Gloriana and Belphoebe. John Lilly, Philip Sidney, and Ben Jonson all contributed to a literary flowering that made English a language of sophisticated artistic expression for the first time. Elizabeth herself was a subject and patron of this literature, understood as a goddess, a virgin huntress, a wise ruler, and a symbol of England itself. This cultural efflorescence was not accidental, but the result of a court that valued learning, rewarded talent, and created an environment where artists could flourish. It was Anne Boleyn's daughter who created the conditions for England's literary golden age, transforming English culture in ways that would influence the world for centuries. Elizabeth's handling of the succession question until the very end of her life demonstrated both her political acumen and her profound understanding of power's fragility. She knew that the moment she named an heir, power would begin flowing toward that person and away from her. Courtiers would hedge their bets, rivals would plot, and her own authority would diminish. By keeping the succession uncertain, she maintained control even as she aged. But this strategy also created enormous anxiety in the kingdom. What would happen when she died? Would there be civil war, foreign invasion, or a disputed succession that would tear England apart? Elizabeth's councillors, particularly the Cecil family, worked quietly to ensure a smooth transition to James VI of Scotland, but they did so without Elizabeth's explicit authorization. She maintained the fiction of uncertainty almost to the end, reportedly only indicating her preference for James through gestures on her deathbed when she had lost the ability to speak clearly. The transition from Anne Boleyn's daughter to Mary, Queen of Scots' son as monarch of England, represented a historical irony that Elizabeth must have contemplated. Mary, whom Elizabeth had kept imprisoned for 19 years and eventually executed, would triumph through her son. James would unite the crowns of England and Scotland, achieving what Mary had failed to accomplish through multiple marriages and political schemes. Yet this outcome also vindicated Elizabeth's careful management of the succession. By refusing to execute Mary earlier, despite numerous provocations, Elizabeth had maintained the possibility of this peaceful transition. By keeping England Protestant and powerful, she ensured that James would inherit a strong kingdom and have every incentive to continue her religious settlement. By fostering secret communications with James in her final years, she smoothed the path for his accession. When Elizabeth died on March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace, the transition was remarkably peaceful. James was proclaimed king within hours, and he rode south from Edinburgh to claim his throne with minimal opposition. Elizabeth's death was mourned throughout England with a sincerity that spoke to the genuine affection many of her subjects felt for her. She had reigned for 45 years, longer than most of her subjects could remember. For many English people, Elizabeth was the only monarch they had ever known. The stability, prosperity, and national pride of her reign stood in stark contrast to the turbulent years that had preceded her accession. The elaborate funeral procession through London attracted enormous crowds. Her effigy, dressed in royal robes and wearing the crown, lay atop her coffin, creating the illusion that she was still present among her people one final time. She was buried in Westminster Abbey in the same tomb as her half-sister Mary VIII, a reconciliation in death that they had never achieved in life. The Latin inscription on the tomb, "Partners both in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters Elizabeth and Mary in the hope of one resurrection." The reassessment of Anne Boleyn's reputation began almost immediately after Elizabeth's death and has continued ever since. During Elizabeth's reign, direct discussion of Anne was dangerous and unnecessary. Elizabeth validated her mother through achievement rather than declaration. But after Elizabeth's death, historians and commentators began to re-examine Anne's story with more sympathy. If Elizabeth was a great queen, then Anne could not have been the evil temptress of Henry VIII's propaganda. Gradually, an alternative narrative emerged. Anne as a victim of Henry's tyranny, a Protestant martyr, a woman ahead of her time who was destroyed by men who feared her intelligence and independence. This rehabilitation was not always accurate. It sometimes created a saintly Anne, who was as fictional as the demonic Anne of Tudor propaganda. But it recognized a fundamental truth. Anne Boleyn's significance lay not in how she died, but in what she had made possible through her daughter. The historical parallel between Anne Boleyn's fall and Elizabeth's triumph raises profound questions about justice, legacy, and the relationship between personal tragedy and historical progress. Anne was innocent of the crimes for which she was executed, yet her death was legal according to the standards of the time. Henry VIII had the power to destroy her, and he used it. But Henry could not destroy her legacy because he could not destroy Elizabeth, and he could not destroy the religious transformation he had initiated to marry Anne. The break with Rome, England's Protestant identity, and Elizabeth's reign were all consequences of Henry's decision to marry Anne Boleyn. In destroying Anne, Henry thought he was closing a chapter, but he was actually opening one that would define English history for centuries. This is revenge in its most profound form, not personal vengeance, but historical vindication through unintended consequences. Elizabeth's refusal to marry can be understood as a direct response to her mother's fate and the fates of her stepmothers. Marriage had destroyed Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and effectively ruined Mary Fye. Even the women who survived their marriages to Henry VIII, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Parr, had been subordinated, used, and discarded when convenient. Elizabeth learned from these examples that marriage meant vulnerability and that queenship and wifehood were fundamentally incompatible for a woman in her position. A husband would either dominate her, as Philip of Spain had tried to dominate Mary the Fern, or create conflicts of loyalty and authority that would weaken her rule. By remaining single, Elizabeth maintained absolute control of her kingdom and her person. This was a form of revenge against the patriarchal system that had killed her mother, a refusal to play by rules that were designed to ensure women's subordination. The Virgin Queen mythology that surrounded Elizabeth transformed her mother's sexual agency, which had been used against Anne as evidence of her supposed adultery and moral corruption, into Elizabeth's strength. Anne had been accused of seducing Henry, of using sexual manipulation to gain power, of being unable to control her desires. These accusations were designed to justify her execution and to reinforce the idea that women's sexuality was dangerous and needed to be controlled. Elizabeth's virginity was the ultimate refutation of this narrative. By remaining a virgin, Elizabeth proved that women could exercise power without sexuality, that female authority did not require male validation, and that a woman's value was not determined by her relationship to men. This was a revolutionary redefinition of femininity that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Tudor patriarchy. It was Anne Boleyn's daughter saying that women could be powerful on their own terms. The religious settlement Elizabeth established made permanent the break with Rome that Henry VIII had initiated for Anne's sake. The Church of England that exists today is a direct descendant of Elizabeth's religious policies. The Book of Common Prayer, the structure of Anglican worship, and the via media between Catholicism and Protestantism all reflect Elizabeth's settlement. In this way, Anne Boleyn's legacy extends beyond English history into global religious history. The Anglican Communion, which includes millions of believers worldwide, traces its origins to the political and religious circumstances surrounding Anne's marriage and Elizabeth's reign. This is revenge on a theological scale. The woman condemned as an adulteress and heretic became, through her daughter, the foundational figure of a religious tradition that has shaped Christianity for over 4 centuries. The military achievements of Elizabeth's reign, particularly the defeat of the Spanish Armada, represented a profound reversal of the military humiliations England had suffered during earlier Tudor reigns. Henry VIII, despite his pretensions as a warrior king, had achieved no significant military victories and had squandered enormous sums on futile wars in France. Edward II's reign saw military failures and the loss of English control over Scotland. Mary I's marriage to Philip of Spain had dragged England into war with France, resulting in the loss of Calais, the last English possession on the continental mainland. This defeat was so humiliating that Mary reportedly said Calais would be found written on her heart when she died. Elizabeth inherited this legacy of military failure and transformed it. The defeat of the Armada was England's first major military victory in decades, and it was achieved under the leadership of a woman, the daughter of the executed Queen. This was Anne Boleyn, vindicated through gunpowder and naval strategy. Elizabeth's naval expansion laid the foundation for England's later maritime dominance. During her reign, English shipbuilding advanced significantly, creating vessels that were faster, more maneuverable, and better armed than their continental rivals. The race-built galleons developed under Elizabeth's patronage were technological marvels that combined the best features of merchant vessels and warships. The establishment of a professional navy, with permanent dockyards at Chatham and elsewhere, created institutional capacity that would serve England for centuries. The growth of England's merchant marine, supported by chartered trading companies and privateering ventures, created a seafaring culture that would eventually enable England to build the largest empire the world had ever seen. All of this began under Anne Boleyn's daughter, who understood that England's future lay on the seas rather than in continental land wars. The colonization efforts during Elizabeth's reign, though largely unsuccessful in her lifetime, established the ambitions and precedents for later empire building. Sir Walter Raleigh's attempts to establish colonies in Virginia failed, with the Roanoke colony disappearing mysteriously. But these failures taught valuable lessons and kept alive the dream of English settlement in the Americas. Elizabeth granted charters, encouraged exploration, and rewarded those who attempted colonization even when they failed. The narratives of exploration and discovery that proliferated during her reign created a national mythology of English maritime destiny. Richard Hakluyt's The Principal Navigations, Voyages, Traffics and Discoveries of the English Nation, published in 1589, compiled accounts of English voyages and presented them as part of a divinely ordained mission to spread English civilization and Protestant Christianity. This was the ideological foundation of later imperialism, and it was constructed during Anne Boleyn's daughter's reign. Elizabeth's diplomatic skills were tested throughout her reign as she navigated relationships with France, Spain, Scotland, and the Holy Roman Empire while maintaining England's independence and Protestant identity. She played potential suitors against each other, using marriage negotiations as diplomatic tools without ever committing to any match. She supported Protestant rebels in the Netherlands against Spanish rule, providing enough assistance to prevent Spanish victory while avoiding full-scale war for as long as possible. She maintained an alliance with Protestant German princes while avoiding entanglement in their conflicts with the Catholic Habsburgs. She corresponded with Catherine de' Medici and her sons, the kings of France, maintaining tolerable relations despite religious differences and occasional conflicts. This diplomatic balancing act required extraordinary skill and nerves of steel. Elizabeth had to appear strong enough to deter aggression, but not so aggressive as to provoke a coalition against her. She had to support co-religionists abroad while maintaining that she respected other sovereigns' rights to govern their own territories. She had to manage Parliament, her councillors and public opinion, while conducting secret negotiations that sometimes contradicted her public positions. The economic policies of Elizabeth's reign promoted trade and commerce, while maintaining a mercantilist framework that sought to maximize English wealth at the expense of rivals. The regulation of trade through chartered companies, the promotion of domestic manufacturing, and the encouragement of privateering against Spanish shipping all reflected a coordinated effort to increase English prosperity. The Poor Laws enacted during Elizabeth's reign, particularly the 1601 Poor Law, established a system of parish-based relief that would remain in place for centuries. These laws recognized that government had a responsibility to prevent starvation and social disorder by providing for those unable to work. This was not charity, but pragmatic governance, a recognition that social stability required addressing the needs of the most vulnerable. The economic expansion of the Elizabethan period created both winners and losers, as enclosure of common lands displaced rural populations and inflation eroded the value of wages. But overall prosperity increased, and England emerged from Elizabeth's reign wealthier and more economically dynamic than it had been at her accession. Elizabeth's patronage of education and learning contributed to increased literacy and the expansion of grammar schools. The Elizabethan grammar school curriculum, based on classical languages and literature, created a literate class that could read the Bible, engage with contemporary religious and political debates, and participate in the cultural flowering of the age. The university system, particularly Oxford and Cambridge, flourished during Elizabeth's reign, producing the clergy, lawyers and administrators who would govern England for generations. Elizabeth herself took interest in the universities, visiting them on progress and engaging with scholars. The expansion of educational opportunity, though still limited to a small minority of the population and heavily biased toward males of means, created the intellectual infrastructure that made the Elizabethan literary and scientific achievements possible. The scientific and technological advances during Elizabeth's reign, though modest by later standards, laid groundwork for the scientific revolution that would follow. Mathematics, astronomy, navigation, and medicine all advanced. John Dee, the mathematician and astrologer, advised Elizabeth on navigation and calendar reform while also pursuing esoteric studies. William Gilbert's work on magnetism, though published in 1600, near the end of Elizabeth's life, represented a new empirical approach to natural philosophy. The practical needs of navigation for maritime expansion drove advances in mathematics and instrument making. The medicinal knowledge preserved in herbals and medical texts, combined with new remedies imported from the Americas, expanded the pharmacological repertoire available to physicians. Elizabeth herself had access to the best medical care available, which probably contributed to her longevity. She survived smallpox, which killed many and permanently disfigured some who survived. She maintained her health and vitality well into old age, defying expectations and demonstrating that women were not inherently weak or short-lived. The role of women in Elizabethan society was constrained by legal, social, and religious norms that subordinated them to men in virtually every sphere. Women could not vote, could not hold most offices, could not attend universities, and lost control of their property upon marriage. They were considered legally and intellectually inferior to men, fit primarily for childbearing and household management. Yet Elizabeth's reign created a paradox that could not be ignored. Here was a woman who governed men, commanded armies, controlled the church, and wielded absolute power in a patriarchal society. Apologists explained this by declaring Elizabeth an exception, a uniquely gifted individual who was essentially masculine in her virtues despite her female body. But the existence of this exception challenged the logic of universal female subordination. If one woman could rule successfully, why could women not participate in governance, education, and other spheres? Elizabeth herself did little to advance women's rights in any systematic way. She was not a feminist in any modern sense. But her very existence as a successful female monarch created a precedent and an argument that subsequent generations would use to expand women's opportunities. The question of Elizabeth's inner life, her thoughts, feelings, fears, and regrets, is impossible to answer definitively, but her actions and recorded words provide glimpses. She wrote prayers and meditations that reveal a woman keenly aware of her responsibilities and the constant danger she faced. She spoke often of her love for her people and her desire to be remembered as a good queen who had served England faithfully. She expressed frustration with her counselors who pressured her to marry, anger at courtiers who betrayed her trust, and genuine affection for favorites like Robert Dudley and even the traitorous Essex. But did she ever think of her mother? Did she wonder about the woman she could barely remember, whose execution had shaped her entire life? The historical record provides no clear answer, but it seems impossible that Elizabeth could have avoided such thoughts entirely. Every time she faced questions about her legitimacy, every time someone referenced her mother's supposed crimes, every time she considered marriage and the dangers it posed to queens, Anne Boleyn's ghost must have been present. Elizabeth's final speech to Parliament in 1601, known as the Golden Speech, provides insight into how she wished to be remembered. "Though God hath raised me high, yet this I count the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves," she told the assembled members. She emphasized her devotion to her people, her willingness to sacrifice her own interests for theirs, and her hope that she would be remembered not for her power, but for her service. "There is no prince that loves his subjects better, or whose love can countervail our love. There is no jewel, be it of never so rich a price, which I set before this jewel. I mean your love." This was masterful rhetoric, but it also reflected genuine sentiment. Elizabeth had devoted her life to her kingdom, had foregone marriage and children, and had survived constant danger to preserve England's independence and Protestant identity. Whether this was worth the personal cost, only she could judge. The mythology that grew up around Elizabeth during her lifetime and after her death transformed her into a symbol that transcended her actual historical person. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, Good Queen Bess, these were not just nicknames, but mythological constructs that served political and cultural purposes. Elizabeth became the embodiment of English nationalism, Protestant faith, and female power. Later generations would invoke her name to justify empire, to argue for English exceptionalism, and to demonstrate that women could lead effectively. This mythologization was not entirely inaccurate, but it simplified and sanitized the complex reality of Elizabeth's reign. She was a brilliant ruler who was also capable of ruthlessness, vanity, and political cruelty. She promoted exploration and commerce that brought wealth to England while also enabling exploitation and suffering in colonized territories. She maintained religious tolerance by contemporary standards while also executing hundreds of Catholics. She was neither the goddess of myth nor the simple woman beneath the crown, but something more complicated and human. Anne Boleyn's reputation has undergone similar mythologization and revision over the centuries. She has been portrayed as everything from a scheming temptress to a Protestant martyr, from a victim of patriarchy to a proto-feminist who challenged gender norms. The truth, as always, is more nuanced. Anne was an intelligent, ambitious woman who used the tools available to her to gain power in a system that offered women few options. She failed to give Henry VIII the male heir he demanded, and she paid for that failure with her life. But through her daughter, she achieved a legacy that has outlasted Henry's achievements and those of most kings. This is the ultimate irony and the ultimate revenge. The woman executed in disgrace became, through Elizabeth, one of the most consequential figures in English history. The execution of a queen for adultery, treason, and incest was meant to be a warning to women about the consequences of ambition and sexual transgression. Henry VII intended Anne's death to terrify other women into submission and to demonstrate male power over female pretensions. But Elizabeth's reign transformed that intended lesson into its opposite. The daughter of the executed adulteress became the Virgin Queen. The bastard became the supreme governor of the church. The rejected princess became the greatest Tudor monarch. This inversion of expectations represents revenge in its most complete form. Not violence returned for violence, but success achieved despite oppression, legacy created from disgrace, and historical judgment reversed through achievement. Elizabeth's 45-year reign brought England from a second-tier power threatened by religious civil war and foreign invasion to a confident nation at the beginning of its rise to global dominance. The England Elizabeth left to James and was politically stable, economically dynamic, culturally vibrant, and militarily competent. The religious settlement she had established would endure, making England permanently Protestant and independent of Rome. The naval and commercial expansion she had encouraged would lead to empire. The literary and intellectual culture she had patronized would influence global culture for centuries. None of this would have been possible without the break with Rome that Henry VIII had initiated to marry Anne Boleyn. None of it would have occurred without Elizabeth's exceptional abilities as a ruler. Cause and effect, mother and daughter, disgrace and vindication. These connections made Elizabeth's reign the ultimate revenge for Anne Boleyn. The women of the Tudor dynasty, Margaret Beaufort, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Mary Vi, and Elizabeth I, all navigated a world that subordinated them while simultaneously requiring them to exercise power through and over men. Some succeeded more than others, and their successes and failures were judged by different standards than those applied to male rulers. But Elizabeth's achievement was unique. She ruled alone, without a husband to share or usurp her power. She maintained her authority for 45 years, in an age when that was extraordinary for any monarch. She outmaneuvered foreign kings, domestic rebels, and religious extremists. She transformed England's position in Europe and the world. And she did all of this as Anne Boleyn's daughter, carrying her mother's blood and legacy, proving through every year of her reign that Henry VIII had been catastrophically wrong to reject and destroy Anne. The ultimate revenge for Anne Boleyn was not violence or retribution against those who had wronged her. Most of them were long dead by the time Elizabeth came to power. The revenge was existential and historical. Anne's existence, her marriage to Henry, and her daughter's birth had consequences that Henry never intended and could not control. He wanted a son to secure his dynasty, and he got a daughter who did it better than any son could have. He wanted to erase Anne's memory, and he created the circumstances for her to be remembered forever. He wanted absolute power over his wives, and his daughter used that same absolutism more effectively than he ever had. This is the irony that makes history tragic and fascinating. Our intentions are never fully realized, and our actions have consequences we cannot foresee. Henry VIII destroyed Anne Boleyn, but in doing so, he ensured her immortality through Elizabeth. As the great 20th century historian G.R. Elton observed, Elizabeth's reign represented the fulfillment of all that the Henrician Reformation had set in motion. Anne Boleyn set that motion in motion, however unknowingly, however unwillingly. Her marriage to Henry VIII broke England from Rome. Her daughter made that break permanent and transformed it from a royal whim into a national identity. This was revenge in its most complete form, not anger or violence, but vindication through achievement, refutation through success, and justice through history's long arc. Anne Boleyn was executed in disgrace on May 19th, 1536. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, died peacefully on March 24th, 1603, having reigned for 45 years as one of history's greatest monarchs. The arc from the one to the other is the arc of revenge, redemption, and the ultimate triumph of unintended consequences over intended outcomes. This is why Elizabeth I was, indeed, the ultimate revenge for Anne Boleyn.